sustainably and create a healthy environment. All right, now on to our program. So most of us are aware of climate change and the need for taking carbon, one of the greenhouse gases, out of the atmosphere as a way to cool the planet. Do you also know that our water cycle is broken and that this has an impact on the carbon cycle? It is important to understand all this on a global scale so we can make good choices at the grocery store and in the way we obtain and use energy. But we can also make a difference every day by the way we garden. Terry and I will go over how carbon and water cycle naturally and how gardening with nature in mind will help these processes. You can make a difference to the climate in your own yard. Today, we are going to begin by giving you a brief overview of Earth's time scale. We will talk about where we find carbon on Earth and go through the carbon cycle. Then we will look at the water cycle and the relationship of soil and water as we discuss soil structure and soil compaction. Next, we will show you what you can do right now in your gardens to store carbon, help water to infiltrate and percolate throughout your soil, and in turn, help cool the planet. We will end with a bit about California native plants and summarize with the thought that soil protection is climate protection. After that, we will be happy to answer and take your questions. Now, I will turn you over to Terry.
Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you and to be doing this presentation with Nancy. Nancy and I have done a lot of work together on the soil and have had a lot of fun. So sunlight, energy, plants, precipitation, and carbon. Life depends on water, while water frequently depends upon life. So life on Earth has been evolving for a very long time. About 500 million years ago, plants moved onto land and the crust of the Earth was changed. The bacteria and the fungi and plants transformed the rock that make up the Earth into carbon-rich soils. This allowed water to infiltrate and be stored in aquifers and springs and run into creeks, rivers, lakes, and out to our bays and oceans. The plants in the microbial community create our local weather. Our local weather is really called the small water cycle. Plants transpire, which means that they release water vapor from the stomata in their leaves. The stomata are on the underside of the leaves of plants. And over 90% of the water plants take up is released as a vapor to the atmosphere. Water evaporating from the land and plant transpiration form clouds and eventually fall in the form of rain over the local area. And interestingly, in the rainforest, about 50 to 80% of water remains local through this cycle. The small water cycle is critical for local weather, and plants drive the system, and healthy soil ensures water infiltrates into the soil rather than runs off. And so one of the reasons we're talking about water is because water vapor is a very strong greenhouse gas. And it's something that we have a difficult time measuring, and the weather itself and climate itself is very, very complex. So in some ways it's easier to measure the greenhouse gases, but water is an important component there. And that's why we're bringing water in as well as carbon into this talk. So soil carbon stocks are really vulnerable to human activities such as deforestation, tillage, and unsustainable agricultural practices. Deforestation alone contributes about 10% of all human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. The drainage of marshlands and turning meadows and grasslands into agricultural land can be particularly particularly problematic as these systems represent the most efficient carbon store on all of terrestrial Earth's ecosystems. So there is much that we can do in our own gardens, and there's choices that we can make, as Nancy said, in the way we choose to eat. And this can make a big difference to our climate. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about Earth's carbon pools. We hear a lot about the atmosphere, but there's a lot of carbon stored in our oceans, and there's also a lot of carbon left in the ground in fossil fuels. And actually, that's a good place for it to stay. So carbon is really not being created or destroyed, but it is moving between these pools. And some of these pools are better for carbon to be moving in and out of than others. Certainly our atmosphere and the ocean are areas where we really have added too much carbon, and our oceans are becoming more acidic due to the carbon stores in them. And our atmosphere is heating up due to the extra greenhouse gases we're emitting. So, but we can focus on life, biota, life, the carbon that is held in living organisms. And as we all know, all living organisms, from trees to humans, are made primarily of carbon. And all the leftovers of living organisms, the decomposition process, is also primarily carbon. Soil is the largest terrestrial carbon sink, and most importantly, it's a safe place to store carbon. It's a very beneficial place to put carbon. So the carbon can flow between life and soil through the digestive process of the soil microbial community. And Nancy's going to be going into quite a bit of explanation on who that soil microbial community is. But the more carbon or organic matter in the soil, the better the soil can hold on to water and nutrients, and therefore the healthier the plants growing in that soil. Okay, next. So what is soil? You know, we don't really think about it that much, but soil is extremely complex. Soil is made up of the lithosphere, which is the parent rock, the sand, the silt, the clay that made up Earth. And we still have plenty of sand, silt, and clay here. Then there's the atmosphere. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen. And then there's the greenhouse gases, of which carbon dioxide is 0.04%. The hydrosphere, which is water in all its forms, liquid, vapor, and solid. And you take these three together and look in the center, and that is the biosphere. The biosphere is right there in the middle because it affects all the other spheres. Without life, the atmosphere, the lithosphere, and the hydrosphere would be very, very different. Without life, there really is no soil. It's soil that's turning that mineral component into soil. Okay, so the soil matrix, you probably have seen this slide. I get really excited about this slide because if you look at it, you'll see that 50% of the space there is essentially empty space. It's room for air and water. 45% is the minerals, the sand, the silt, and the clay, that parent rock material that's been broken down over geological time through weathering. And then about 5%, and oftentimes more, and oftentimes less, is the organic matter. That organic matter is key. This is the biosphere part. This is what's bringing it all together and turning minerals into soil. Of that organic matter, 80% is humus. Humus is the decomposition of the microbial digestive process. This is a pretty stable material. 10% do all the work. 10% of this 5% do all the work. That's the organisms. And another 10% is the roots of the plants. So the roots of the plants are feeding those organisms, and the organisms are doing all kinds of things to turn that soil, to turn that sand, silt, and clay into an actual living soil. And as I said, Nancy's going to be going into a lot of detail on that. It's pretty exciting what's happening in the soil. I'm sure you've all heard of soil texture, and I think there's can be a lot of confusion between the word texture and structure. Soil texture just refers to the parent rock or mineral component of your soil, the sand, silt, and clay component of your soil. And it's really just a measure of the particle size. So if you look in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that blue dot. And that blue dot is an example of a grain of sand compared to the yellow dot, which is an example of silt, sizing of silt compared to sand. And then that teeny tiny little dot that you can hardly see that's pink would be the clays. Clays are so small that they actually have an electrical charge to them, so that they're able to hold on to elements like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. So clays, although many of us, have sort of a love-hate relationship with clay in our soil, clays are very beneficial because they hold on to nutrients, and they also are very good at holding on to water. The diagram here is, you see the percentages on the sides, and you can easily take a quart jar and put in about a cup of your soil and fill it with water, shake it really good till it's all broken up, sit down and let it settle out, and you'll find that the sand will settle out first, then the silt will settle out, and then the clay will settle out. And from there, you can take measurements and get a percentage of your layer of sand, your silt, and clay, and find your soil somewhere on that diagram. And I think for a lot of us, certainly in the areas around the bay, closer to the bay, we probably have soils that have a little bit more clay in them. But I think a lot of people are surprised to find that oftentimes there's a lot of soils in this area that fall in the sandy loam classification. Okay. Yeah. So this is a really wonderful slide that Walter Jen, a soil microbiologist and climatologist from Australia, drew. And he likes to talk about the sponge, the soil carbon sponge. And this is really the focus, really a big focus of our talk tonight, is to explain to you what makes up that sponge and why it's so important, and what you can do in your own garden to grow it. And Walter really likes to draw the connection between climate change and the ability for soil to infiltrate and hold water. And so you can see on the right side, you've got a nice little tree growing there, and you've got lots of roots going into the ground, lots of little microbes down there. The plant itself is sending carbon into the soil to feed the microbes. The rain, when the rain comes down, is able to fall onto the ground and infiltrate into the soil instead of run off. The heat vapor goes up, but it forms clouds, and therefore we get, once there's enough moisture in those clouds, we get some rain. And interestingly enough, clouds are formed, it's actually bacteria, a form of bacteria that actually help our rain cycle. It's the bacteria in the air that are able to form water crystals, and they're very, very common. I think they've not been known for too long, but they're very important to our water cycle and to producing rain. When you look on the left side, you'll see that looks very hot. The sun is pulling any moisture that might be in the ground out. It's evaporating. The poor little tree is barely alive and not letting any, probably not much is coming, not much transpiration is coming out of that little guy. Any rain that does happen to fall on the ground will tend to run off because that soil will tend to be very compacted. So the rainwater will run off, taking the silts and the clays along with it. And then the moisture that is there creates a haze in the atmosphere. And this haze helps hold the heat in a little bit. So you can see that we really, humans have a choice in how we treat the soil, and we can treat the soil and develop the sponge and have good water infiltration and fill up our aquifers, or we can ignore the soil and degrade the soil and have it become compacted and end up with a very hot, uncomfortable climate. So I would like to turn this over to Nancy now, and she's going to talk all about the life in the soil.
Great. Thanks so much, Terry. So, how does soil gain the ability to soak up water as well as allow it to permeate through the soil to the aquifers? Terry talked to you about the soil texture, and that had to do with the mineral portion of your soil. When you add in organic matter, which is the living and previously living organisms in your soil, such as plants, animals, and microbes, then aggregates are created. When your soil is aggregated, it is said to have good structure. This is an up-close drawing of one aggregate. Notice how it is a combination of minerals, microbes, plant roots, as well as pore spaces where air and water can flow through. In a well-structured soil where you have many aggregates, not only are there pore spaces within that aggregate, but you've got several aggregates, they don't fit tightly together. When they come together, they leave gaps that also create pore spaces. So again, air, water, and plant roots can easily move through. Adding organic matter to create aggregates means that your now well-structured sandy soil will hold on to the water better, and your clay soil will drain water better. On the next two slides, we will look at how air and water flow are affected by good soil structure compared to compacted soil. So let's look at this diagram on the left. All of the dark and light brown shapes are representing aggregates. The white spaces shows air, and the purple shows water clinging or adhering to aggregates and being held in some pore spaces. This shows a soil that is well aggregated or has good structure, where air and water easily flow through while some water is held for later use. Please note, though, that water adhering to aggregates, which mostly happens in clay soils, because clays hold tightly onto water, and in some tiny pore spaces, the water may not be available to your plant roots. But wait a minute. Aha. But in a healthy soil system, where plants form mycorrhizas or relationships with fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi can get to that water. It's really tiny and thin, and it can get into those tiny spaces, get that water, and send it back to the plant. Pretty nice relationship. Okay, so now let's look at the diagram on the right. This shows what happens to soil that has been compacted. When soil is compacted, the pore space diminishes significantly and air and water flow is impeded. Notice now how much more water there is as compared to the air. When soil structure is destroyed, the pore spaces disappear and too much water is held. So now there's not enough air in the pore spaces for plant roots to function adequately, and the aerobic microbes, which benefit plants, cannot function. Some go dormant and some die. Here is another diagram of the same scenario, but this time think of this as 1 cubic foot of soil. So you're thinking about a volume of soil. So this graph on the left shows a healthy soil with the correct balance of minerals, air, water, and microbes. In the diagram on the right, you can see the changes that happen when the soil gets compacted by disturbance. Can you see the decrease in the air as well as the organic matter? The structure needs to be built again so that more pore spaces are there where air and water can move through, and the aerobic soil microbes as well as plant roots can thrive. So now we're going to talk about carbon's influence on soil structure, water infiltration, and percolation. First, you should know that more water is held in soil than in all the freshwater lakes, ponds, rivers, streams, and creeks. Okay, soil's pretty important, isn't it? So how water moves through soil is also really important. Soil aggregates, and therefore soil structure, is mainly created by the carbon glues that come from plant root exudates, bacteria, and fungi. When water moves through well-structured soil, some is held in soil pores, as we saw in the previous diagram, or clings to clay particles or aggregates, and some recharges aquifers. When aquifers are recharged, wells remain active, and there is no subsidence or lowering of the land due to depleted aquifers. In a well-structured soil, water moves through the ground rather than over it to enter creeks, which prevents loss of sediment. In this scenario, we don't lose our topsoils to erosion, and our creeks, streams, and rivers stay clear. They're not muddied. And as an additional note, the microbial life, which is made of carbon, sees everything as food and can break down many toxins into non-toxic elements. Pretty nice job for microbes. All right, now let's talk a bit about how carbon cycles in your own garden. I find it helpful to see real photographs and imagine what these processes look like in my own garden. So here on the top left, you see this little lettuce plant. So with the sun shining down from above and water taken up from the soil, this little plant is taking carbon dioxide out of the air and releases carbon in the form of carbohydrates as well as oxygen into the soil. The smaller pictures below show bacteria and fungi, which are beneficial decomposers, which will take up the carbon as nutrition for themselves and hold it in their bodies. When they are consumed by other microbes, such as amoebae or nematodes, the carbon is transferred from one organism to the next. These microbes also breathe just like we do. They take in oxygen and they release carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide comes up through the soil, through those pore spaces, and reaches with the plant. And of course, what does the plant do? If the sun is shining, it uses that carbon dioxide and cycles it again. Through decomposition, these microbes are also instrumental in creating stable humus, which is mostly carbon, that will stay in the soil for a very long time. And this is an example of a carbon sink. Now, this is a fun thing. Okay, the top right photo shows what the root system of your plants should look like if you have a healthy living soil. The roots of this plant is covered, the root of this plant is covered in a rhizosheath, and that's what you should see in your own plants in your garden as well. That rhizosheath is protecting this plant and contributing to its health. This rhizosheath is formed by the exudates that are coming out of the plant, the soil mineral particles, glues exuding from microbes, and tying it together with fungal hyphae. These are protecting the roots, and they're bringing lots of health to the soil. I'm sorry, to your plants, because they're creating structure. These are aggregates that you're seeing. If there is not a living soil community, what will you see? You're going to see just bare roots with very little soil adhering to it. So try this in your own gardens tomorrow. Just dig up a plant, even if it's a weed, and see if you find that your plant roots have a rhizosheath. Because even weeds are pulling carbon dioxide from the air and putting carbon in the soil to feed the microbial community. So maybe next time you see a weed, you can have a little more respect that at least it's doing a great job in the function that it's performing. So another thing that you can do to check out how your soil is doing is to see whether your soil has been built with soil life by testing for what we call water stable aggregates. So how do you know if it has water stable aggregates? Well, you can try this procedure here. You can take a clump of soil from your garden, put it aside and just let it dry out for about a week. And then take it after it's dried and gently submerge it in water and watch. Does it stay together? Does it fall apart? And then think about what this might tell you. So to go ahead a little bit, since you don't have time to puzzle this out, this shows an example of a soil that has been made with soil life, and it has water stable aggregates, which means when water comes in contact with it, what does it do? It flows through the pores, and the soil itself stays together, and that's what you want. In this soil, which comes from an agricultural soil which has been tilled for years, it is really dirt, not made with soil life. When it comes in contact with water, there's none of those microbial glues, and the whole clump just falls apart. So try it. You may be surprised that your soils are doing better than you think. Okay, so Terry talked to you earlier about how soils are degraded on a global scale, but now let's look at how people inadvertently destroy structure in their soils at home. They do this through excessive tilling or digging, by foot traffic. Have you ever had an area of, say, your lawn or someplace where people just kind of tend to walk through the same place over and over and it creates a path? By leaving soil bare, you just kind of forget about it and you don't plant it, or for whatever reason you've left it bare. By using biocides, which meaning insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, or by using synthetic fertilizers. And I want you to notice before we go to the next slide So you're going to transform a beautiful, lush, diverse plant community into looking more like this if you do these practices. But notice who is coming to the rescue here. It is weeds. They are the ones that can start growing in dirt and start preparing the soil to accept more plants in. So we now know how soil gets degraded, but what's actually happening in the soil? Well, when soil is degraded or compacted, it loses biological structure. The result is that water and air cannot move through that soil like it's supposed to. Through digging and tilling, fungal hyphae and mycelia are just torn apart. Tilling or turning the soil also causes aerobic bacteria to dominate, and their populations grow very quickly. When this happens, they use carbon and any nitrogen in the soil to build their bodies, causing more degradation of soil structure and loss of fertility. A diverse community of microbes and soil life cycles nutrients. This is where plants get their nutrition from. When soil becomes compacted, we disrupt this cycle. Using biocides creates a decline in the diversity of the microbial community. And again, having lots of different microbes is super important. And this limits nutrient cycling when you get fewer and fewer microbes in the soil, or fewer types. Using fertilizers does feed your plants nutrients directly, so you can see growth in your plant. But what happens is it limits the relationship between the plant and the microbial community. The plant puts out those exudates and feeds the microbes, which in turn help feed the plant. When you feed the fertilizers, the plant no longer puts the exudates out into the soil to feed those microbes. And again, the community of microbes is limiting. And so while your plant may grow, you've not done anything to help keep that soil structure going. When land is left bare, the sun dries it out, the wind blows the soil particles away, and the rain compacts the soil. When soil is compacted, water cannot infiltrate into the soil, so it just runs off the top and takes the topsoil with it. Under these conditions, most plants fail to thrive. But this is where pioneer plants come in, and we sometimes call them weeds. So now let's review how water and carbon is impacted by compacted or degraded soil versus soil with good structure. In a compacted or degraded soil, rain and irrigation water just runs off along with the soil. But if you have good structure, that water infiltrates right in. In a compacted soil, water can puddle on the surface, and deeper down, it can create anaerobic conditions, which means there's a lot of pockets without air, which is not good for most of the plants we grow in our gardens. In good structure, the water infiltrates into the soil and aerobic conditions exist, and water is held in micro and macro pores and available to plants over a very long time. Sometimes clays and silts in a compacted soil tend to kind of move down, creating a compaction layer lower down in the soil as well. However, in a well-structured soil, clays and silts are held in place by those water-stable aggregates, and water can percolate deep into the soil horizons, recharging groundwater and aquifers. In a compacted soil, gas exchange is very poor, and we've been talking a lot about oxygen and carbon dioxide, and anyway, that exchange slows way down. However, in a well-structured soil, that gas exchange, the gases flow freely. And As you might guess, in a very compacted soil, very few plants grow, where in a good structured ones, many plants grow, photosynthesize, and put carbon into the soil. And lastly, in a compacted soil, you have a decrease in organic matter. And of course, in good structured soil, there is an increase in organic matter, which increases carbon cycling and carbon sequestration. Now, before I turn you over to Terry, I'm going to leave you with this lovely picture. This is just showing how the carbon cycles in a beautiful setting. And I just want to highlight a few things that we talked about. This again reminds us how carbon cycles, and remember that organisms breathe out carbon dioxide and plants can use this during photosynthesis. As animals and plants die, the elements in their bodies are immobilized and mineralized by soil microbes. Much of the carbon turns into humus. The most important lesson here is, in order to keep water and carbon cycling, keep your soil covered to protect the biological soil structure so that all these natural processes can occur. Now I will turn the program back over to Terry.
Wait, Nancy, before you do that, somebody
Yes.
put in the chat, they had a question regarding the fertilizer. It says, is fertilizer concern true for organic fertilizer or only chemical-based fertilizer?
Can we answer that at the end? We can make that the first question, okay?
Okay.
Great, perfect, thanks. Good question.
Mhm. Okay, thank you, Nancy. That was really great. And I hope you all feel really inspired by all the life going on in the soil, doing all sorts of important jobs for us and for the larger community. So what can we do to grow and maintain healthy soil in our garden that stores carbon and that promotes a healthy water cycle? Well, the first thing I'd really love to encourage you to do is to go out and observe your own garden. Go out and look at different times of the year. After the rain is a great time to go. And these pictures here happen to be from our garden after the recent rain we had. We didn't have much this year, but we had a little bit. So up in the far left-hand corner, you'll see some mushrooms popping up. And those mushrooms are saprophytic mushrooms. Saprophytic mushrooms are decomposers. They break down all the woody material, and they are fantastic. They know how to decompose all kinds of things, including hydrocarbons. And I think they're even now finding that a lot of these mushrooms can decompose our plastics. So it's a huge community out there. We don't even notice that they're there until they send up their little fruiting body and send out their spores to inoculate other areas in your garden or someplace else nearby. Sometimes you'll see them when you pull the mulch aside, and you'll see the little white fungal threads running through the soil, and that's more than likely from the saprophytic or decomposing mushrooms. The picture next to that is a log, and it is being decomposed by little polypores, turkey tails, and they're going to slowly break that whole log down and turn it into a humusy material. I have sort of a funny story. When we moved to our home in Lomamar, we have a carport. We have these big Doug fir timbers that are holding up the carport. And the carport apparently had a leak in the roof for quite a long period of time because there were some beautiful turkey tail mushrooms decomposing those timbers that were holding up our carport. And all this beautiful humus was falling down on our cars every evening when we parked there. So there are places where we want them and places where we don't really want them. Then the next slide over is a nice little handful of soil. You know, pull the mulch aside, stick your hand in, pick up a handful of soil, look at it closely, see how you can actually see the aggregation there. And you can see the pore spaces, so you know that when it rains, that water is going to infiltrate into that soil. Take a good sniff of it. What you're smelling is just all the microorganisms and the work that they're doing. It's usually, I find it to be a very lovely smell. Then below that is a area that's was quite very compacted, has a little bit of algae growing on it. And after the rain, you notice that there's some holes. So the worms are already starting to open that soil up. It's already starting to change. So so it's amazing what nature is able to do, what the microbial community is able to do to reheal the soil and build that structure. Next slide over is another picture. This is of a weed just pulled out of the garden soil. And as Nancy said, showing all those rhizosheaths, holding all of that sand, silt, clay, organic matter together. The little weed is sending carbon down to feed all those microbes. And there's a good exchange going on there, and humus is being built in the soil. Next slide over is worms. Worms are fantastic. They aren't everywhere on Earth. There are some areas like conifer forests where worms probably aren't, at least earthworms aren't so present. But where we are, earthworms are really important members of the community. They do a great job of moving soil around and opening passageways. So you can see those holes there, they're pretty significant. Lets a lot of air in, good gas exchange, starting to open the soil up so that water can move in. So it's a very good sign when you have earthworms. And earthworms like to eat and graze upon the microbial community. So if you have a lot of earthworms, it generally means you've got a lot of nice microbial food there for them to eat. So do go out during all the seasons and just pay attention, pull the mulch aside, look at what's going on. You'll be amazed at what you find in your garden when you look up close. So I think it's pretty clear that our job is really to help the microbes create soil structure and to protect that soil structure. As Nancy said, if there's not protection, that soil is going to dry out and blow away. And in a state of nature, there's always something on the soil. You really will never see bare ground in a state of nature. And it's all the leaves and everything, all the branches, everything that has died is laying on top of that soil, and it's being broken down. And this happens to be a picture underneath a canyon oak. And if any of you are fortunate enough to live with an oak tree, the best thing you can do for your oak tree is let those oak leaves fall on the ground and create a beautiful mulch over the ground. And there's nothing that smells better than pulling that mulch aside and taking a good sniff of that soil. And when you walk on soil that has been left alone and let the leaves fall on it over a period of time, it actually feels like you're walking on a sponge. So you know that when it rains, that rainwater is going to infiltrate and move into that soil. All of that material that is falling on top of the ground is being broken down and being recycled and becoming food for the microbes, who in turn will get that to the tree. So it is a beautiful system. We all feel like we have to use a lot of fertilizers or we have to do something, but think of the state of nature and who's feeding and watering nature. So more and more, once you get this living soil going in your garden, you'll find you need less and less inputs. What you really need to do is just be sure and protect the soil. So that protection can be what naturally falls to the ground. It can be mulch. It can also be leaf or plant cover. The picture below the leaves is a picture of our garden. We grow a lot of natives, and we grow herbs as well, and a number of different kinds of fruit trees. And we have really good plant cover, so the sun cannot get down and sort of solarize that soil. The plants are covering it and protecting it. And the plants break the fall of the rain when the rain comes. You know, you don't think of rain as being hard, but rain is very compacting. If you have a bare piece of ground, of soil, and leave it bare through the whole rainy season and we get a lot of rain, you will come back in springtime and find that soil quite compacted. Areas that aren't covered by plants really do benefit with a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch, especially your pathways. The next slide over is sheet mulching. This is a great method for enlivening really compacted soil. And we have in the resources at the back of our presentation, you'll find a nice little link to a good method of sheet mulching from Stop Waste in the East Bay. And I just want to add a couple things because I do things a little bit different than them. I always like to put a little bit of compost on top of the soil. You can leave, if you have turf and you don't want your turf anymore, sheet mulching is a great way to go. Or if you've got a weedy area of your yard and you want to do something different there, don't worry about pulling the weeds if they're annual weeds. Just go ahead and mow your turf or knock your weeds down, wet the soil, moisten the soil and all the plant material, put down a thin layer of compost, moisten that, then put down a layer of cardboard and overlap the cardboard a good 6 to 12 inches or so. You don't want any sun to get through. Moisten that on both sides. Put another layer of compost on top. I like to put only about a half an inch to an inch. I think Stop Waste recommends more. Moisten that, and then put 3 inches or so of mulch on top of that and moisten that. You will be amazed at what happens after one season. An ideal time to do this is in the fall, maybe right after a winter rain, so you've already got some moisture in the ground. So it's a great time to do it. And then come back in the spring, you'll find that the cardboard should be completely decomposed if it has good contact with the soil. You really need that good contact because if you have any little air pockets in there, it's not going to decompose. And so then that's a great time to go in and plant your garden. One thing I do want to say is I know a lot of people are sheet mulching by putting cardboard down and then just putting mulch on top. That really isn't always such an effective way. Sometimes if the cardboard doesn't have contact with the soil, it will not break down. It will just sit there under the mulch. And when the rain comes, the rain will actually run off the cardboard and you will actually have less moisture in your ground. So make sure if you decide to do sheet mulching, make sure that that cardboard is wet and it has really good contact. Remember, the microbes need a moist community to do their job. Another great way to build soil structure and improve soil is with cover crops. We have also included a California cover crop chart for cool season and warm season cover crops. It's highly recommended that you use a diverse cover crop. The more different kinds of plants you put down, the better, because those plants are feeding all different kinds of organisms. Plants, by the sugars that they release, the carbon from the root zone, call in different microbes. So you want a real diversity of cover crops. And grow those cover crops out. And then this is a good thing to do in the winter if you have a vegetable garden. And sometimes, I don't know why, but sometimes we just don't get around to planting vegetable garden in the fall and winter. So go ahead and do a cover crop and let the cover crop enliven your soil. It's really important for your soil to have a living root in it as much time as possible, because that plant then is photosynthesizing, taking that energy from the sun and taking that carbon dioxide and breaking it apart and creating sugars, releasing oxygen. It's an amazing process. And for the soil to really function properly, it needs a living plant. Okay, so go on to the next slide. So, compost and vermicompost are really great additives to the garden. What they're doing is they're supplying life, the microbial community, and they're also supplying some soluble nutrients. So you can use compost and vermicompost as a top dressing in your garden over maybe around, it just depends on what you're growing, but around your fruit trees. Just put it on top of the soil. You do not need to till it into the ground or mix it into the ground. In your vegetable garden, put it on side dress your vegetables with compost or vermicompost. Just a thin layer, 3/8 or half an inch is really great. If you don't have good plant cover over it to shade it, because remember, the sun is really powerful and it sucks the moisture right out of the ground. And it also sucks the moisture right out of your compost, and therefore your little microbes aren't very happy. So cover it, make sure it is protected by plant cover or by mulch cover. You can also, if you have turf, and some people need turf for their children or their pets. If you have turf, consider going to a compost application twice a year in fall and spring rather than using fertilizers. The compost will provide those nutrients. It will also provide life, and that life will help break down any thatch that you have. The fungi in there will break down the thatch in your turf. It will also encourage deeper roots, which is a good thing. So then you don't have to water as often. I wasn't done, Nancy.
Sorry.
Sorry. I'm okay. So yeah, the broad fork is, I see we're getting late on time. Sorry about that. Broad fork is a great way to open up compacted soil if you don't want to sheet mulch or do a cover crop. And it's just simply putting, it's an instrument similar to a pitchfork, but a little bit tougher, putting it in the ground, rocking it back and forth, putting compost over the top. That's a great way to get a little bit of compost into your soil and life into your soil. You do not want to till your soil. That's really, I know I say here, you can do a one-time application of tilling, but tilling is really so destructive. Anything you can do to avoid that is good. Always keep compost and mulch away from the base of your plants. Very, very important. Okay. So California natives, it's really, we love California natives. They support the insects, they support birds, they support all kinds of pollinators, they provide habitat, food, and shelter. They thrive in our climate, and little or no water once established, and they support a much larger community. So I really encourage you to consider putting natives in your garden. We've got a few, we've got some really great nurseries, and one of them, Las Politas Nursery, has a wonderful website that really gives you some really nice information on natives. And this happens to be our garden with a beautiful ribes in bloom and then some poppies underneath. And it is, I tell you right now, it is just spectacular. Okay, next slide. So for California natives need the right place. They really need living soil. They're not going to be happy in really compacted soil. They need a mycorrhizal relationship. They really don't want fertilizer. They need mulch or leaf litter, and they need really, really careful irrigation. And in some cases where we live, we actually, once we get the natives established after the first summer, we don't need to do any irrigation. So in how to plant, it's really important to know the sun orientation and the water needs. I just can't stress that enough. Sometimes we fall in love with the plant, but we've got to make sure we've got the right place for that plant to grow. It may not be happy on a south-facing slope. It may need a north-facing slope. So make sure you really understand that plant's needs. Do plant very wide holes, but not deep, because you don't want that root ball to sink below the grade. And so keep that root flare at the grade. And always, I didn't put this on here, but always backfill with your native soil. Do not amend your soil. Backfill with your native soil, because those plant roots are you want them to go out into your native soil. It's very important that they move out into your native soil. So do backfill with the native soil. And then even on natives, I like to apply just a little 1/4 inch or 3 eighths inch of worm castings or really well-made compost around the drip zone and out beyond, just to inoculate that soil, add a little bit of life, and then mulch to protect the soil and hold the moisture in. So soil protection truly is climate protection. Sunlight powers the whole system. The microbes and plants maintain the balance. Good soil structure. Good soil structure allows water infiltration. It also supports carbon sequestration and healthy plants. So protect the soil from the elements with plant cover and or mulch. Let the microbial community and plants feed each other, and observe and support the community. It really is an ecological system. The earth really is one big community. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. And Sandra had asked us to talk about soil and carbon and climate. And then she said, could you add a little bit about native plants? And then she wanted to know about gopher control. And as you can see from time, we don't have time to do that. However, Sandra, this is for you, because this is part of gopher control in my yard. Ready? So if you can see that, that's a great blue heron eating a gopher.
Okay, so how do I attract a great blue heron?
I don't know, but I had to show this to you. And I figured everybody else would appreciate it as well. Okay.
You talked about like don't till the soil, but I mean the gophers are constantly
Yes, they are.
Soil over, and I got that gotchips.com and completely covered front yard and backyard with an entire load of chips. A year and a half later, no evidence of chips because it's all been turned over by the gophers.
Well, actually, that's probably good. Helping your soil.
Go get more. I mean, you cannot believe how much work it was to wheelbarrow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm on a slope of a hill, so I mean, this is not
right.
a task.
Yeah.
It was just, oh my God, those gophers.
Right. Anyway, I just wanted to show that we do have reference slides. So if anybody watching the recording, you can freeze it and, capture that. And I want to thank Sandra again for having us. And of course, if you have any questions, you can ask a Master Gardener at our helpline. So thank you so very, very much. And I'm going to stop sharing and we can go to questions, but I will answer the question first about the organic fertilizers. Yes, I probably should have said, beware of synthetic fertilizers, that most organic fertilizers are actually feeding your soil. In other words, feeding the soil microbes, which in turn will turn it into food for the plants. And that is a healthy way to go, as opposed to, dousing it with nitrogen or not dousing it with phosphorus or something of that nature. And, people, it's okay if people have used fertilizers. What we're talking about here is how a natural system works. And if you're interested in going from a more chemical-based gardening to natural, you just sort of ease off your fertilizers a little at a time while you're growing your microbial community.
Okay, so I have a question. So I allow yellow mustard plants to take over my backyard between my little sticks of fruit trees back there, because I only water the trees. This is in the far back area of my yard. And so, yeah, so you see the field of mustards in pictures, but my yard looks like that, right? But so then I allow it to, because it attracts the bees. My yard is just buzzing with bees this time of year. And then I let it go to seed. And then when the thing dies, that's when I put it in my yard waste bin. So then I do have bare soil between the fruit trees, because it's only rainwater that gets the other stuff. But yeah, so what do I do? Do I get more, just keep bringing in every year more and more wood chips? I mean, how do I keep the soil alive, the microbes alive in the soil between the trees?
Terry, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I would suggest going with cover crops, and there's a nice little handout that we've included. And I would plant a diversity of cover crops. It sounds like, we have gophers here, so I can totally sympathize with you. And I notice that they tend to like compacted soil. And once we started getting our garden in, because when we moved here, it was just weeds and very compacted soil. Once we started growing our natives, we started having less and less of a problem with gophers. I do want to say one thing about gopher baskets. We used gopher baskets early on, and what we found is that the roots really don't go out of the baskets very well, so we don't use them at all anymore. If we're worried, we just recently planted some fruit trees in a new area that has, that mainly has a lot of weeds in it. And we did use a little bit of made gigantic gopher basket out of aviary wire, which is going to be broken down over time. And those roots will be able to move out beyond. But for what you're doing, I would definitely recommend going with cover crops and doing like 6 or 8 different kinds of cover crops. It can be really a lot of fun too, and you bring in all kinds of beneficial insects, as well as you're really enlivening your soil, getting a lot of carbon into your soil and opening your soil up. And hopefully you will have less of a gopher problem over time.
Yeah, but then it implies I have to water that area besides just the tree areas, right?
You're going to have to water a little bit to get them established, and it's been rough this year. We've had not very
So
much
little water, yeah.
Yeah, but you are going to have to water a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have certain areas that are more landscaped, and I use the natives.
Mm-hmm.
But then other places, it's just these little fruit trees, and it's just more open and walkable, in terms of you can walk, freely walk without stepping on anything once the mustard dies back.
And you
One
leave
thing-
the mustard on the ground, right? You just let it die back and just stays there and decomposes?
Well, what I do is I let, like the leaves that come from the trees, I let those stay and decompose. But the yellow mustard is like once they've done their thing, it's just these giant stalks that are dead, because some of them are like 4 feet tall, right? I mean, they get really tall. And then, so then I pull them out of, I do pull them out of the soil, but what you're suggesting is maybe just tip them over and leave them there?
We'll definitely leave the roots in the ground. And if it might be a too big a task, but if you can just chip them up, that would be great, and leave them as mulch.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Kelly, were there some other
Yes.
chat questions? Okay.
Yes, there were a couple of other questions. The first one is from Amalia. She's wondering if you have some good resources for information on citing California natives.
I would say Calscape. Well, I don't know if it's particularly citing, but they do go into great detail about what kind of environment they like. And you can even put in your zip code to make sure they work in your area, but then they'll also talk about whether they are better in an open chaparral plant or better as a creekside plant. And I know Las Politas also has good information on their site. Yerba Buena has good information on their site. Terry, do you know others?
Yeah, and the California Native Plant Society. I don't know
Yes,
why
right.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, of course,
Yeah,
of course. Yes.
That's a really good one. And Grassroots Ecology is their nursery. Deanna there is just so knowledgeable.
Yeah, there's a lot of support in our area for
Yeah.
for natives. I'm just starting my journey in it, and Terry's been helpful to me, but yeah, I've been trying to find all these resources myself.
I have more questions, but I'll let other people go. I can kind of go on.
Yes, so we do have one other question from Chris. Any suggestions for implementing gardens at elevation and in a forest environment? And some background there is that he has close to 1.5 acres at 6,200 feet in the mountains in far northeast California, and would like to get a good garden started there once he builds the property.
Well, I would say that all good gardens start the same way. You want to get plants in the ground and build your soil. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're starting with. Let's see, I'm sorry, did you say it was in a forest environment? Yeah, so it sounds like it's pretty shady, and I don't know whether you mean like an edible garden or whether you mean more like filling in plants. I'm not
Yeah,
sure. Maybe
edibles. Yeah, I want
edibles. Okay, great.
Yep. And yeah, the land is untouched. The last time anybody was at that property was the late 60s.
Oh, wow.
It's pine forest. It's got 50 years of pine needle duff. So it's plenty of stuff there. My concern is with elevation, short growing cycle, and the fact that I'm on basically granite mountaintop. I don't have the soil depth. I don't have the water sources and all that I would normally have here in the valley.
Yeah. Terry, looks like you wanted to say something. Go for it.
Well, once again, it's depends what kind of vegetables you want to grow, what kind of food crops. I mean, they all need some sun. So you're going to
I need clear trees to get sun.
Oh, okay.
It's
So
just-
you're going to need that. You're going to need at least 6 hours of sunlight. More is better. And if you're really on granite, maybe you end up doing some raised beds.
That's what I was afraid I was going to have to do.
Yeah, because the roots really need, at minimum 12 inches. I mean, it's going to be really hard.
As that leads into the second half of the question, if I'm going to I'm probably going to end up having to do raised beds. What challenges or since I'm not going to have, since it's a self-contained environment, not a naturally diverse, spread out environment, right? How do I get my soil growth, my soil life, and maintain that, since I won't have access to the full, acre and a half of land? It's, now a 100-foot box or whatever it is.
So I was going to say you could do some sheet mulching. Have you ever heard of the word hugelkultur?
I've heard the term and never looked into it.
So I would look into it. It might be interesting if you can dig down a little bit. It's basically taking, starting out with large branches or trunks of trees and layering branches, and then bringing in more materials which decompose over time, but you're really building soil.
Right.
The other thing that came to mind for your situation is to start out, like, I think blueberries, because it's going to be acidic soil.
Oh,
And
yeah. I
so
tried planting a blueberry up there. It died.
really,
Yeah. I've got, when I tried to dig down, even though it's got all the pine needle duff, I got about 3 to 6 inches of soil before I hit granite slab.
Yeah.
so you're going to have to build soil on top. So, I was going to say, the sheet mulching, as Terry suggested, with maybe cover crops on top, and then leave those cover crops to decompose. You're going to have to spend some time building up that soil. And you're going to have to do it with plant roots. So it may be a little time before you get the vegetables you want.
Yep.
But I think that's where I would start. Terry, do you have anything else to add?
No, it's
It's challenging.
Too. Yeah.
Okay, now to throw one other challenge at you too, even though it's not in California, what about high desert soil? I have another acre and a half in the high desert of Nevada.
Wow.
I've never done, born and raised here, so don't know much about it, although I did do a lot of hiking in the Sierras, and was amazed at what grew in that rock rubble. But it wasn't,
I think it would do well there. I went to a conference last year because I think it was during COVID. So it was in the spring, put on by, I think it was the University of Arizona or Arizona State. And they had some amazing speakers, and a lot were addressing those issues. Also, I don't know if you've ever heard of Jeff Lawton, Geoff, and his last name is Lawton, Lawton. He's out of Australia. And if you look up YouTube under Greening the Desert, he has done amazing projects in like Jordan, where he's turned these desert environments into incredible oases.
I've seen some of his YouTube stuff.
Yeah. And again, it's just starting and planting, and in the desert, it's really about collecting water. And then getting that cycle going in your ecosystem. To me, that seems to me like the basis of what you've got to do in the desert. And then it's the organic matter that's going to, if you put water in desert sand, it's probably just going to go whooshing through, right? So you've got to build up that got to add organic matter so it can build up that structure to hold it, like we talked about the sponge. So that's going to be your task there, is to, you probably have plenty of sandy soil and you just got to make it better, and plant roots are going to be your friend, but also you're going to have to think about, how do I collect water? How am I going to position my garden so it gets the most moisture and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Actually, can we talk a little bit about the importance of mushrooms in communication between trees and other plants? I think it's a fascinating, the issue of, plants don't talk. Yes, they talk, and who helps them in the communication? Do you want to touch on that? It's a fascinating, because sometimes we don't appreciate that, and then we go and we pluck out those mushrooms because we think it's wrong. It's growing in my gorgeous clean garden, right?
Yeah. So I was going to say just quickly, I'm actually taking a fungal ecology course right now, and if my memory serves me correctly, because I haven't studied, well, I'm in the middle of studying for the final exam right now, but I think the mycorrhizal fungi, well, no, I guess it's the arbuscular, don't actually form mushrooms, but they do a lot of the communication. The ecto form like truffles and things like that. But yes, they have these incredible networks where they connect all these plants and are sending out what is it called? Biochemical signals, something like
Yeah.
that. Do I have that right? Yeah, it's fascinating. And you must know Suzanne Simard?
Hard.
Is that how you pronounce her last name? She's coming out with a new book, and I've actually pre-ordered it on Amazon. I'm really excited to talk about the communication, but it is a fascinating study. And if people don't think yet that soil is a living thing, then they need to start reading and asking the things just like you're asking, because it is absolutely wonderful. Yeah, people see mushrooms and go disease, and sure, a few of them might be, but a lot of the mushrooms you see are actually doing their job. It's the plant is sick and the mushroom has come to take care of it and is cycling it back into soil. And yeah, you may not want to see it, but there's another reason, like, why is that happening? Something else is going wrong in your system. And if we start thinking more in systems rather than, oh, I see that bug, what do I do to get rid of that bug? You see the bug and go, oh, wait a minute, what is that bug? Oh, well, what's that bug doing there? Oh, what's its role? And then you keep asking the questions until you figure out what's going on in your whole system instead of just looking at one little thing. I think that's kind of the important. I kind of went off the rails there.
Fantastic. And for the gentleman who asked about agriculture in the desert, I grew up in Israel, and Israel really focused, because there's so much of a desert area, and agriculture in the desert has been really a brilliant science with brilliant results. So was it Chris?
Yep.
Look up and you will be inspired.
Mm-hmm. Will do.
So I have another question. I love pistachio nuts, and they come with a shell around them. And I started thinking, those shells, they're like little cups and that would hold, water or air. And I started like collecting them and chucking them out into my yard, thinking that ultimately the gophers would turn them under, and then they would create little pockets for air in the soil. Does that make sense to you guys? Does that make like logical sense that it's a good thing to do?
I would think of them more as a mulch. As far as them moving into the soil and the gophers turning them into the soil, they're going to be broken down over time and decompose. So they're just food for life in the soil, so they can go on top of the soil. And if the gophers move them in, the microbes will take care of them and break them down, turn them into humus.
Okay, so it won't necessarily, not for long anyway, for a little while, it'll allow for little pockets of air in the soil, but ultimately.
Yeah, and what you want is you just really want to build those soil aggregates, which you're doing with your mustard. Your mustard plants are helping with that. And you want to build those soil aggregates so then the water has all kinds of places in which to be held.
Okay. Oh, I had another question. Okay, so you said like don't use, chemical fertilizers. Okay, but then if you have a tree or a plant or something that's kind of got the yellowy leaves, which kind of means it is low on iron, right? What would you recommend then to fix that?
Well, if when your plants aren't looking healthy, yeah, they aren't getting what they need. It's hard to say exactly what it is. It may or may not be iron. Once again, you really want to develop that life in your soil because it's those microbes that are going to feed your plants. What I would do is apply compost around the plant, and I might make a little bit of, if I have a really nice compost, I might make a compost extract, which is just taking water that's been treated. So, because we have chloramine in all our water, which is a disinfectant. So treat it with either something that you use for aquariums, or if you have access to humic acid, something like that. And then put your compost in a paint strainer bag and put it in the treated water and massage the bag gently for a few minutes, and then water that into the root zone of your plant. And that will provide some soluble nutrients and some life. And then, cover crops will do a lot to help build that soil structure, and a lot to help cycle nutrients in the soil.
So does it make sense then to put cover crops then right up against my little fruit trees then?
No, not right up against them, but
Nearby.
yeah. You always want to have good air circulation. So yeah,
So,
but very nearby.
Terry, the other thing I was thinking of for Sandra too is if she could find a permanent plant that would be a good ground cover, then it could stay.
Yeah.
It could stay on the ground year round, and
Yeah.
it over time it would probably outcompete the mustard. I don't have a suggestion off the top about what, but you might want to look into that, something that would work in your site and how much sunlight you get and all
Yeah, there's
that.
a lot of sun up there. It's at the top. of the
Yeah,
hill.
so look up a ground cover that then you don't have to worry about doing things different season. And once it's, and if you can get one that's a little drought tolerant so that you don't
Yeah,
have to
that's
be
what I
using too
need.
much water. So I would do a little research on that, because that might be a good way to go in your situation. And then you really wouldn't have to worry about having either having to pull plants out or worrying about covering it up when the mustard's not there.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of the native grasses are good, and they need a little bit of water. Out in our area, we live in Lamamar, so we don't have to water them, but they really provide a lot of fibrous root growth and do a good job of opening up the soil.
Where's Lomamar? Where is that?
It's between La Honda and Pescadero.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're closer. We're about 15 to 20 degrees cooler than you guys. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I have a question. I have a pomegranate tree, but it never fruit. So I was wondering, it's been a long time, I would say at least 7, 8 years. What can I do?
I'm not too familiar with pomegranates. I wonder,
Me neither.
do they need to be, do they need a pollinator plant?
I have no idea.
Yeah, so some fruit trees do, and I don't know if pomegranates do or not. I think this would be a great question to send to the master gardeners. Yeah, because if it needs to be pollinated, then that's why you're not seeing any fruit.
Okay. And what is their email?
It's on the presentation. I think their email address for help desk.
Kelly's putting it on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she's
Yeah, I just
got
added
it
a
there.
link to.
Yep, I see it.
Yes.
It's
So
on the chat.
in the chat, there's a link to the Master Gardener helpline.
Okay. Are we able to get this the copy of the slides?
Oh, I have recorded this. It's going to be on YouTube, and I'll put it on the meetup site, the link to the YouTube.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I was reading about the pollination, and it says it can self-pollinate. And you can have one tree, so there must be another reason.
There must be, yeah.
It could be sun. It could be, yeah.
Well, could it be lack of bees pollinating it, doing the pollination?
Could be. I've had that on my zucchini, where it wasn't getting enough pollination, and sure enough, I'll go around with my little Q-tip and pollinate it myself, and all of a sudden the zucchini's doing better, because
Oh,
for whatever
really?
reason the pollinators didn't come.
So you need to plant something that's going to attract the bees first before you get fruit tree, or do that alongside your, right? Plant things as well as your fruit trees. You plant something that the bees are going to like, and then you have your pollination right there, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I bought a house about 11 years ago in Napa, and it had a lawn in the front and in the back, and I didn't want to use excess water. So I took the lawn out in the front and put in a lot of plants. And there was also a small tree there, and I didn't know what kind it was, but it grew up huge, and it's now a red oak. And,
Oh,
and
pretty.
and it has a billion leaves that drop, and I saved them and I fertilized my back lawn. But my question is, so I put a lot of redwood compost over the bare dirt next to the plants that were there, and now I have 100,000 weeds. Should I have put cardboard first, or did I not sheet mulch it properly?
I can answer. Yeah. So did you use the redwood bark by chance?
Well, it was bark, and then it was a part of the branches, because it wasn't all red, it was green stuff, and somebody's tree was cut down, and so I got some of.
Oh, okay. All right. How thick did you go with the mulch?
I thought I'd put at least 2 inches, but maybe I should have done more.
Yeah, probably at least 3 inches. And, any sunlight that gets through is the weed seeds are going to germinate.
Yeah.
And this is an example of if you put the cardboard underneath, you'd want to be, you really should do the compost, because people have gotten into a lot of trouble doing the cardboard and mulch and no compost. Because cardboard just doesn't break down if there's not good soil contact. Yeah.
Okay, so should I just leave the weeds now for the carbon sequestration, or for the benefit?
Can you knock them down? Yeah, you could. Yeah,
Cut them back.
Yeah, cut them back or leave
But
them.
don't pull them out, just cut them back, or?
Yeah, I wouldn't
Okay.
pull them out.
Okay.
But
Yeah, the
Thank
roots
you.
do a lot of good in your soil. A lot of people don't know that when you take, unless you're trying to get rid of something like a Bermuda grass or something that's really invasive,
Right.
then sure, you want to take them out. But for most plants, it's best if you leave the roots in the ground, because you're feeding the microbial life. And, once they decompose, you've got all those airways in there. And anyway, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. And then is thatch something that's really hard to get rid of? Is that like a deep rooted type of grass?
Bermuda grass?
Is that Bermuda grass what they call thatch, or?
Could be.
Because there's this one grass that grows up, and it's so hard to get out. I have to dig really deep to get the root, and there's like a little ball, or like a little, I don't know what it is. The edges are kind of serrated, and it's really difficult to remove.
Is it a grass or a sedge? Maybe.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
I wonder if it's nut grass.
Yeah, maybe
Wet?
it is.
Is it really wet there? Is the soil really wet? Is it a moist area?
No.
Yeah. Okay, then no. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, hard to say. You need to send us a picture.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Yeah, you can actually send it to the helpline. Because that's what they do all the time.
Oh, okay.
Send a couple really good pictures and describe your situation, and then they'll do research for you.
Thank you. And that's in that line is in the chat?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And one thing I just wanted to say about your weeds, just cut them down before they go to seed if you don't want to have more. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then I have some mustard also growing with yellow flowers. Should I just leave those or pull them, or?
You know, they're good for the soil, but if, you know, and like the bees too enjoy them. So
Yeah.
it really becomes up to you and
Yeah.
what you want, but having a green plant growing regardless of whether it's a weed or not, it's important.
Yeah. And I have a lot of borage too, which the bees love.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah,
that's so hard to get rid of. It's like, oh my God, it's everywhere.
yeah, it is.
But the
terrific.
flowers are tasty. Well, if you like it, I like the taste.
Yeah,
Are
they're
they
pretty.
edible? Really?
Yeah, they
Yeah.
are. The flowers are edible.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, great. Thank you.
Mhm.
So this whole point of doing, like you were talking about putting in, you know, organic material and then the cardboard and then the mulch on top, that's to, because in the cardboard, you want the cardboard actually helps the soil.
Well, what the cardboard does is it just really blocks any sunlight from getting through, because it's really sun that's going to germinating. So it's just really to get a good cover over the top of the soil, and you want to use the compost on top and below to inoculate with the microbial community, and moisten everything really well. And they eat up the microbes eat up that cardboard really, really fast. And it's kind of interesting when you do, you know, we did some sheet mulching out here, and we did it in the spring. And we came back in the late summer and pulled the mulch aside, and the cardboard was gone. We could stick our hand right into the soil and pull up a handful of soil, and that handful of soil had 2 worms in it. So, so there's, you know, a lot of value.
Okay, so the end result though, what you're going for is to improve the soil and
The soil structure, build that microbial
Soil.
life in the soil. Yeah, build those aggregates so that
But why do you need to keep the sunlight out for that? Because it's too drying, you mean, or?
No, because the sunlight will cause weed seeds to germinate. So that's why when the last person was talking about mulch and redwood mulch, you put down redwood mulch, and it's very fibrous, and sunlight gets through it. It doesn't look like it to us, but sunlight gets through it, and weeds germinate right through that redwood mulch. And so you just want a good cover, unless, you know, and the weeds have their advantages too, but generally when you're doing sheet mulching, you're wanting to build some soil structure, and you're wanting to get rid of either turf or weeds so that you can put in something else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to interrupt for a second because I realized I did not give any credit to our friend Kelly Torikai,
Yeah,
who has been doing an awesome job in the chat, answering your questions and putting in links. So I think we need to give her good
Thank you,
kudos. I'm
Kelly.
giving her a hand clap here.
Yeah.
Okay, so is that it then? Were you done with questions and such?
Looks like it. So
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, clearly you did a lot of work putting this together. There's a lot of information.
I hope it was okay to digest. It's hard to know what people know and don't know, and it is a lot of information. But
yeah, and I think that's a good too that we recorded it, because then people can watch it twice or stop it when they need to take notes or something. 'Cause
right.
it's a lot of information to take in at one time. It's like reading a textbook. You're not going to get it all in one fell swoop.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm hoping that we'll get something with Sarah when she.
Oh, I know, when she feels better.
Yeah. Yeah, she was going to put, what was it again? She was going to put something about California natives. Was that it?
Well, it was something you requested a talk, and I can't remember what the topic was. What did
Yeah.
you request? I can't
Well, that's what
remember.
I was thinking. I think it may have been on California natives, and she decided to fall off a 20-foot ladder instead of putting together a slideshow. What do we do to get out of something, you know?
So I want to interrupt you real quick. Sandra, you might want to end the recording now.
Okay.
to save some